So as we mentioned, the person who is a combatant, when in the hands of the enemy, he will be considered as a prisoner of war. So a prisoner of war is a status that is granted only to combatants. Which kind of combatants? The combatants in the international armed conflict, because in non-international armed conflict, the person, when he is combatant and he was taken by the enemy, then in this case he will not be considered as a prisoner of war. So you have to bear this in mind, that prisoner of war is only status related to combatant when they are in hands of the enemy during the international armed conflict. Also, who can be considered as a prisoner of war? According to the Protocol 1 of the 1977, this protocol considers that members of the regular armed forces, also the militias or the volunteer corps, these persons, as well as the members of the organized resistance movement, all of these people are considered prisoners of war when in hands of the enemy. The Third Geneva Conventions, as we mentioned before, is a convention that is related only to prisoners of war, but it put some strict conditions to consider that the person who belongs to the irregular armed forces or the organized resistance movement a prisoner of war. They require some stricter conditions than those included within the additional protocol number 1. Anyway, we have to know that the combatant, whether he is a person who works under the supervision of the official army, or even member of our organized resistance movement or regular armed forces, these people can be considered as prisoners of war when in hands of the enemy. Anyway, the combatant are considered to be hors de combat when they actually are in the power of the adverse party, when they clearly express an intention to surrender, when they are wounded, sick, to such an extent that they are incapable of defending themselves. In each of these cases, these persons are considered as hors de combat, and that if they abstain from any hostile act and if they do not attempt to escape, like when someone is wounded but he still wants to fight, then in this case he is not prisoner of war, he is not even hors de combat, and he is legitimate target, so I can end his life in this case, simply because he is not hors de combat, because he doesn't abstain from any act of hostilities against me as his enemy. As soon as the combatant is hors de combat, then in this case he must be shown the due regard and he must be protected. So this is regarding the prisoner of war. Prisoners of war, for your information, is a person that cannot be prosecuted for merely being part of the hostility, since he has the right to defend his country. So if we capture an Israeli person as a prisoner of war, we cannot prosecute him for merely being part of the hostilities between the Palestinian state and the Israeli one. But if this Israeli guy or this Israeli soldier commits or committed before grave violations to principles of international humanitarian law, then he may be found guilty of crimes of war or war crimes. And in this case, we can hold him responsible and we can prosecute him for the violations that he committed during the armed conflict. So prisoners of war cannot be prosecuted for being part of the hostility unless they commit war crimes or crimes against humanity, as we will show in question 18 regarding 19 regarding the implementation of IHL. Then if he commits such crimes, he will be prosecuted before the International Criminal Court or before the national courts for the crimes committed by him. Anyone, this is regarding the first category of the conflicts. So the first category was the international armed conflict. We have two main categories: the civilians and the non-civilians, or the combatants or the combats. Regarding the non-international armed conflict, we have to know that international humanitarian law doesn't give any specific categories regarding persons who are protected during the non-international armed conflict. This is because the states do not want to give the members of the organized non-state armed groups the status of combatant, simply because if they are combatants, then when they are in hands of the state, they will be considered prisoners of war, and they will not be protected, and they will not be like prosecuted for the acts committed by them, since they are right in their fighting against the state. But this is incorrect. These people are people who are fighting against the state without having a specific correct reason, or right reason, or even a just reason. So in this case, we will not consider them combatants, and we will consider them as people who violate the domestic law, and they can be prosecuted under the domestic law. So they are not persons who are protected under the IHL. I mean generally, but they may be protected under the Article 3, Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. Anyway, these persons, as mentioned here, this enables IHL to protect civilians and those who are no longer taking part in hostilities, because there is no combatant status in no international armed conflict. There is no prisoner of war status either. This means that members of the organized non-state armed groups taking up arms in such conflict may be prosecuted under the domestic law for doing so. So the main difference between the international armed conflict and non-international armed conflict regarding the personal jurisdiction is that in international armed conflict there are two kinds of people: combatant or the combatant civilians, while in a non-international armed conflict we have only one category. Actually, the person who is not taking part in hostilities must be protected under the Common Article 3. However, the person who fight against the state mustn't be considered combatant. He is not prisoner of war. He mustn't be considered a illegitimate target. He is legitimate target, and he can be targeted, and he can be killed during armed conflict. And moreover, he can also, in addition to all of this, he must be prosecuted for doing his combatant acts. Okay, thank you. To this limit, we can consider that we end this lesson. Inshallah, the coming lecture will be about the next question regarding who is bound by the IHL. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in another lecture, inshallah. Goodbye.